Okay, this lesson is going to be on section 2-3. Starts on page 62 in your trig book. So it'd be helpful not only to turn to page 62 and try to follow along, but then it would also be helpful if you would have a calculator ready. This section is on finding trig function values using a calculator. So you should be using a calculator for everything you're doing in this section. Okay? First of all, I want to start with one of the most common mistakes, and that is not having your calculator in the correct mode. We are going to talk about radians, but haven't done so yet. So you need to make sure every time, especially if you're borrowing one of my graphing calculators, that you hit this button, mode, and then if I zoom in on the screen, you need to make sure that degree mode is highlighted versus radian mode, okay? So you need to check that every time. So, first thing we're going to do we're going to evaluate the sine of 49 degrees, 12 minutes. So, I notice that I am given the angle. When you are given the angle, you know you're just going to use the sine button. However, before I use my calculator to do this, I need to convert this to decimal degrees. So you need to remember that this is really the sine of 49 plus 12 over 60. All right, so use your calculator to do 12 divided by 60.2. So really we're finding the sine of 49.2. So I'm going to hit sine 49.2. There is the sine. Remember, that is the ratio of the opposite side and the hypotenuse side. Okay, let's round to 4 decimal places. So it's about 7570. Okay? Let's evaluate the secant of 97.977 degrees. Now, if you look on this calculator and on any calculator you're going to use in this class, you've got sine, cosine, tangent, and then above those you have sine inverse, cosine inverse, and tangent inverse. Those are not reciprocal functions. Sine inverse allows you to solve for an angle. So do not try to use sine inverse, or in this case cosine inverse, to figure this out. You need to think about, if I'm trying to solve for secant, how is secant related to cosine? So you need to remember that those are reciprocal functions. All right, so if I want to know the secant of an angle, that's equivalent to 1 divided by the cosine of that angle. So this is really going to be 1 divided by the cosine of 97.977. Okay, so pay attention when you're given these reciprocal functions. It's not an inverse. Do not use the inverse button. So now I'm just going to go and use my calculator to evaluate. So 1 divided by cosine 97.977. I get negative 7.2058, which should make sense because if you remember, secant and cosecant have to be numbers outside of 1 to negative 1. So that makes sense. Okay, round to about 4 decimal places. And you'll just have to check directions to see how many decimal places they want. Okay? This next one, maybe you try it before I get going. We're going to do the cotangent of 51.4283 degrees. So I want to do the cotangent of that. So remember, you're using your calculator for everything in this section. Again, you need to think about how our cotangent related to one of your other functions that you do actually have a button on your calculator. Remember that cotangent of theta is the same as 1 over tangent. So this is really going to be 1 divided by the tangent of 51.4283 degrees. I'm going to do that quickly off screen. 1 divided by the tangent, 51.4283. I want you to also notice on both of these things that I've typed into my calculator, if I zoom in, notice both of those things, I have 2 parentheses. You need to close your parentheses. All right, so I got about 0.797. Okay. So that's about 0.7975. Okay? Oops. So, all of those examples, you are evaluating. Notice we know the angle, and we are trying to find what's on the right-hand side of the equal sign. One more quick example. The nice thing about your calculator is it will find the sign of negative angles for you, and also angles greater than 360. So you don't have to worry about necessarily going and finding a reference angle or anything like that. It will do all of that work for you. So you would literally just type the sign of negative 246 degrees. Notice for sign, I should always get a number between -1 and 1. You can always be checking yourself. So again, sine and cosine should be any number between -1 and 1. Cosecant and secant have to be outside of that range. You might want to pause and write that down again. That will help you determine whether your answer is right. Okay, so in all of those, we have been evaluating. Okay. Now, your next set of directions would be use a calculator to find an angle, theta. All right. So now I am going to find this angle. They're going to give me this ratio of sides, and I'm going to find the angle. So notice how the directions are different. So you're going to need to use a different button on your calculator. For example, what if I told you that the sine of theta is equal to 1/2? You are trying to get theta by itself. This is an equation you're trying to solve. Okay? You need to know that theta is going to be equal to the inverse sine of 1/2. That's what those buttons on your calculator are for. So when you are trying to find theta, you need to be thinking inverse. Same when you're trying to find any angle. And this is a common mistake people make. So those inverse buttons are for finding angles. So now I'm going to go back to my calculator. Okay. And I need to find inverse sine. So you're going to hit second and then the sine button. I've got inverse sine of 1/2. Here it's going to be super important that you put parentheses, close the parentheses, and I get exactly 30 degrees. Okay? So theta is 30 degrees. You also need to make sure when you are finding an angle that you appropriately label it with a degree sign. Okay? So now what if I wanted to find the sine of theta? So I want to find theta again when this ratio is 0.96077091705. Whew, what theta will give me that? You're literally going to do the exact same thing. Now you just have a longer ratio to type into your calculator. Okay, so I'm going to type that in. So again, we go with sine inverse okay, so I did the sine inverse because I know I'm trying to find an angle, typed in that big long decimal, and I got about 73.89 degrees. Typically, angles, they're going to ask you to round to 1/10 of a degree, so I think that angle is about 73.9. And again, look, I labeled it correctly, okay? So please pay attention. Now, what happens? We're still using our calculator to find theta. However, what happens when they give you that the secant of an angle is about 1.054589? Okay? How am I going to figure that out? Well, you could try to look back at what we did before when we were evaluating secant. Notice we recognized that secant was 1 divided by the cosine of theta. Okay, so we did 1 divided by the cosine of 97.977. These are a little bit different. You do need to remember that secant theta is equal to 1 divided by cosine theta. All right. Now notice this is secant. So I need to do 1 divided by this number. Okay. And then I evaluate using the cosine inverse. So notice when I go to type here, I am not going to use enter, and then I want to do the cosine inverse of that. So on my notes here, it's really the cosine inverse of this ratio. So look at how this is different than the example we just did. Okay, so now I want to take this and do the cosine inverse of that. So if you didn't know, you can use second cosine inverse, and then if you hit second again and the negative button, it says A and S above it, that's for answer. So it will take your just previous answer, which was this decimal, and use that. So that angle is about 18.51 degrees. Again, you could go and check by doing 1 divided by the cosine and see if you get this number, and it should be close to that. Okay? The last part of this section is on page 63, and it's grade resistance. An important thing that you need to be able to do as a mathematician is, given any formula, you should be able to solve for any of the missing information that you're given. Okay? So I am given this formula. F is going to stand for the force or grade resistance. W stands for the weight. And theta stands for the grade or the angle. Okay? So I could ask you to solve for the force given the weight and theta. I could ask you to find the weight given theta and the force, and I could also ask you to find theta given the weight and the force. So those are 3 different scenarios, but you should be able to solve for any of these variables given the other 2. I think the easiest one would obviously be to solve for force when you know the weight and theta, because then you're just evaluating. The other 2 take a little bit more work, but you should still be able to solve for them. Okay? So, there are examples on page 63 that I'm going to do. Okay, so let's find F for a 2,500 pound car traveling uphill at theta is equal to 2.5 degrees. Okay. So, I'm finding force. So, force is my unknown. The weight is 2,500 times the sine of theta. Theta is 2.5 degrees. Then all you need to do is use your calculator to evaluate. And as long as you put parentheses around this, you should just be able to type the entire thing in. So, 2,500 times the sine of 2.5. So the force required to keep that up is about 109.05 pounds. Force is in pounds. Okay. I want you to go and look at examples on page 63. It's example 3. This is part A. You need to look at B and C. Try to write them down. They're on the bottom of the page. And then go through and see if you can get the correct answers like they get on page 63. Remember, using this formula, I could ask you to solve for any of the 3 variables. We have only done F, but I could ask you to find the weight or theta. Think about, if I ask you to find theta, what are you going to have to use on your calculator? Because theta is an angle. So how is that going to be different? What button are you going to have to use? Okay, so I want you to go and I want to see these examples in your notes when I come around to check them tomorrow. I want to see you try example 3B and 3C on page 63. Try them by yourself, then check your answer and see if you got it correct.